1.
All right. Well, in the last session, I gave you a break from hearing the name Josephus, but that's over. In the next 25 minutes, you're probably going to hear the name Josephus a good dozen times. So we're going to continue our study of 10 case studies comparing the book of Revelation with the work by Josephus titled Wars of the Jews. And so far, we've looked at 4 case studies, 3 which related to the seals, 3 of the 7 seals, and we also looked at 1 example from the trumpets. And now we're going to move on to case study 5 and look at 2 more case studies involving the trumpets, and probably in this session one of the bowls, and then tomorrow we'll have 3 more case studies. So now we're on case study number 5, and this one is taken from Revelation 9:13 through 16, which reads, "Then the 6th angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, 'Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates.' So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million, and I heard the number of them." Okay, so this relates to the 6th trumpet, and momentarily we'll take a look at a quote from Josephus about 4 commanders who led a murderous army. But first, here is some background. During the winter of AD 67 to 68, a man by the name of Ananus, if that's how you pronounce it, Ananus II, who was a former high priest in Jerusalem, urged the people of Jerusalem to oppose the lawless Jewish zealots who had taken over the temple. Josephus referred to them as blood-shedding villains. And a zealot leader by the name of John Levi of Gischala had recently come to Jerusalem. He arrived in November of AD 67. And he pretended at first to be on the side of Ananus the high priest, who was the leader of the peace movement. And Ananus invited him to be an ambassador to the zealots. However, John then quickly betrayed Ananus and falsely claimed that Ananus had himself invited the Roman Emperor Vespasian to conquer Jerusalem. So in response, the zealot leaders Eleazar ben Simon and Zacharias ben Phalak requested help from the Idumeans. Now, Idumea was a nation south of Judea. They told the Idumeans that unless they would come immediately to their assistance, the city of Jerusalem would be in the power of the Romans. So the Idumeans quickly prepared an army of 20,000 men directed by 4 commanders. And this is written about in Wars of the Jews 4.4.2. which says, "Now these Idumean rulers were greatly surprised at the contents of the letter, and at what those that came with it further told them. Whereupon they ran about the nation like madmen, and made proclamation that the people should come to war. So a multitude was suddenly got together, sooner indeed than the time appointed in the proclamation, and everybody caught up their arms in order to maintain the liberty of their metropolis," meaning Jerusalem. "And 20,000 of them were put into battle array, and came to Jerusalem under 4 commanders, John and Jacob the son of Soses, and besides these were Simon the son of Cathlas, and Phinehas the son of Clusothus." Now, this is a little bit difficult, and I'll definitely be interested in any feedback that anyone has about this, but there's clearly a discrepancy between the text that I read from Revelation, which mentioned 200 million, and the number 20,000 that I'm suggesting here. And earlier I quoted from the New King James Version, which, like most versions, gives some variation of the number 200 million. Young's literal translation, on the other hand, says 2 myriads of myriads. The interlinear translates this phrase as twice 10,000 10,000s. Well, the word myriad in Greek meant 10,000. So 2 myriads was 20,000, which was the same number that Josephus assigned to the Idumean army. Going back to the Old Testament, a similar expression is used in Psalm 68:17, which reads, "The chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of thousands. The Lord is among them, as in Sinai in the holy place." Well, if you look at the various translations of that verse, far more often it's translated to simply say 20,000. You won't find them suggesting 200 million, like the similar phrase in Revelation does. So when it comes to Revelation 9:16, it seems that most translations have unnecessarily squared the number 10,000 before doubling it, and therefore come up with 200 million instead of 20,000. So I'll definitely be interested if anybody has feedback or knowledge about that. But in any case, if that's correct, John and Josephus both described an army of 20,000 that was led by 4 commanders. And the Idumeans came to Jerusalem in February of AD 68. And we'll hear more about them in the next case study. Yes?
I've got just an injection.
Sure.
Part of this misinterpretation of 200 million by the futurists,
Right.
I were one, is that we involuntarily drag China into this because that's the only nation big enough to have 200 million soldiers. And there's poor China going, we really don't care what's going on over there. What? So as futurists, we continue to come up with this mishmash of illogical, perspectives that really doesn't work. And when applied with a little bit of logic and interpretation, all of a sudden you can go, you know what, China's not that bad. We don't need to be blaming something on China in the future. So I just want to add that. That's where that leads when we get this misinterpretation.
Thank you. And that interjection doesn't count toward my time, right? No, I'm just kidding. Okay, great. No, I think I'm good anyway. So we'll move on to case study number 6 now. Another trumpet judgment. This is found in Revelation 11:7-13, which reads, "Now when they, the 2 witnesses, finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days, and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these 2 prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. In the same hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. In the earthquake 7,000 men were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven." So this vision is also part of the 6th trumpet, or at least it appears before the 7th trumpet sounds. And this is the first passage in Revelation where the beast is mentioned. And it's also the first mention of the great city, which is mentioned and defined as being the city where Jesus was crucified, that is Jerusalem. So Josephus described a morning in February of AD 68 when the city of Jerusalem woke up to find that 8,500 people had died during the night due to an earthquake and a slaughter carried out by the Idumeans, who we talked about in the last case study. And here's how Josephus described the earthquake in the midst of a great storm in Wars 4.4.5. He wrote, "For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continued lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth that was in an earthquake. Anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some grand calamities that were coming." And here's how Josephus described the slaughter that was carried out by the Idumeans that very same night. after they managed to saw through the gates using saws, and break into the city. This quote is from Wars 4.5.1. The Zealots also joined in the shouts raised by the Idumeans, and the storm itself rendered the cry more terrible. Nor did the Idumeans spare anyone, for as they are naturally a most barbarous and bloody nation, and had been distressed by the tempest, that is the storm, they made use of the weapons against those who had shut the gates against them. Now there was at present neither any place for flight, nor any hope of preservation, but as they were driven one upon another in heaps, so they were slain. And now the outer temple was all of it overflowed with blood. And that day as it came on, they saw 8,500 dead bodies there. So recall that John said, quote, in the earthquake, 7,000 men were killed, unquote. Well, Josephus, in telling this story, did not distinguish between how many died in the earthquake and how many were killed by the sword that very same night. So I want to suggest that it's possible that the earthquake killed 7,000 people and the Idumeans killed an additional 1,500, making up a total of 8,500. Well, the next day, the Idumeans, who were working with and on behalf of the Zealots, hunted down and killed a couple of former high priests, one that we've already talked about, Ananus, and also Jesus. And these two had long tormented the Zealots by opposing their war and working for peace. And here's a description from Josephus about their deaths from Wars 4.5.2. The Idumeans sought for the high priests and went with the greatest zeal against them. And as soon as they caught them, they slew them. And then standing upon their dead bodies in way of jest, upbraided Ananus with his kindness to the people, and Jesus with his speech made to them from the wall. They proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial. I should not mistake if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city. He, Ananus, preferred peace above all things. He was a shrewd man in speaking and persuading the people, and had already gotten the mastery of those that opposed his designs or were for the war. And this at last was the end of Ananus and Jesus. So, we see that John and Josephus both described two individuals in Jerusalem who were hated and killed and not allowed to be buried. And if we go back a couple verses earlier from what I read to Revelation 11:5-6, we will see that they also both describe a couple of men who were not able to be conquered by their enemies until a particular time. And they describe this happening at the very same time as an earthquake, which coincided with the deaths of at least 7,000 people. And I wish I could take more time on this, but I realize this particular case study may be a bit controversial, or at least deserves a deeper study. And if you're interested in seeing a more detailed study on this topic, you can find one at my website, adammaarschalk.com. And if you go to the page, I have pages across the top. If you go to the page titled Beast of Revelation and scroll down to the post titled The Two Witnesses Killed by the Beast, you can find a more detailed article on this study if you're interested. And I just want to mention that until a couple of years ago, actually, I believed that the beast was Rome generally, and Nero specifically. And I won't get into it now, but I now believe that the beast was Israel generally and the Zealot movement specifically. And on my blog site, I've been presenting a lot of evidence for that in this series. And related to that, I just want to mention one thing that we should note here in Revelation 11 is the fact that the beast oversees the deaths of the two witnesses in Jerusalem. This is just something to think about. If this indeed happened in AD 68, then I want to suggest that the beast could not possibly have been Roman, because from August of AD 66 until April of AD 70, if you follow the works of Josephus and look at what he says, it's pretty clear that the Romans had no presence whatsoever in Jerusalem. except for a few days in November of AD 66, when Cestius Gallus tried but failed to attack the city. So if the events of Revelation 11 took place anytime between late AD 66 and the spring of AD 70, then the beast who overcame the two witnesses must have been Jewish, not Roman. And based on the case studies that we've looked at and the ones that we're going to continue to look at, I would say it's very fitting, according to the timeline, if you can refer to the chart, it's very fitting if the events in Revelation 11 took place in early AD 68. Okay, so one last case study for this session is one of the bowls. Okay, this case study comes from Revelation 16, 3 through 6. And I'm looking at my clock here, but I forgot, what time did I start? About how much? 6, 7 minutes? Okay, we're good. All right, so Revelation 16, 3 to 6. Then the second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it became blood as of a dead man, and every living creature in the sea died. Then the third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters saying, "You are righteous, O Lord, the one who is, and who was, and who is to be, because you have judged these things. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, for it is their just due." So this is a description actually of the second and third bowl judgments. And Josephus described how in the spring of AD 68, Vespasian, the Roman general and future emperor, prepared for the eventual siege on Jerusalem by marching against Gadara, the metropolis of Perea. He described that in Wars 4.7.3. And he also came against the rest of Perea as well, Wars 4.7.6. Now, Perea was the region east of the Jordan River, just next to Judea and Jerusalem. Now, some of the Jews who fled from Gadara joined with others and got in great numbers together and fled to Jericho. That's recorded in Wars 4.7.5. And they did so with Placidus, Vespasian's assistant, who was chasing them. So Placidus drove the whole multitude to the riverside along the Jordan River. And that's when things took a really tragic turn. Here's a quote from Wars 4.7.5 through 6. They then extended themselves a very great way along the banks of the river and sustained the darts that were thrown at them, as well as the attacks of the horsemen who beat many of them and pushed them into the current. At which fight, hand to hand, 15,000 were slain, while the number of those who were unwillingly forced to leap into the Jordan River was prodigious. And Jordan could not be passed over by reason of the dead bodies that were in it, but because the lake Asphaltiris was also full of dead bodies that were carried down into it by the river. And now Placidus put his soldiers on board the ships and slew such as had fled to the lake. In case you're not familiar with Lake Asphaltiris, it was actually the Greek name for the Dead Sea. So what we see there in that quote is that first we saw that John saw a sea that became blood as of a dead man, Revelation 16:3. And he saw that every living creature in the sea died. So what we saw in that quote was that Josephus said the Dead Sea was full of dead bodies, and that Placidus killed everyone else who fled to the Dead Sea. So John saw rivers and springs of water turn to blood, and that those who shed the blood of saints and prophets were given blood to drink. Josephus said that a multitude of Jews was pushed into and unwillingly forced to leap into the current of the Jordan River. And that river was so full of dead bodies that no one could pass over it, and some of them drank the bloody water as they drowned. Yeah. So on that gruesome note, I will bring this session to a close, and I'm sure the next speaker will bring you something a little more encouraging and wholesome. And then tomorrow we'll conclude with the final 3 case studies and the conclusion. And if there's time, I'll get a little bit of feedback from people and be glad to hear what you have to say. So thank you.